Well, hi there. I've got a sponsorship for this episode. It's Mii. Do you like Japan? I like Japan. I was living in Japan for a little over a month, and while I was there, I got really attached to snacks. And when I got back to America, you know what I couldn't find? Those snacks. There's so many things that are exclusive to Japan that I just couldn't get. And I say couldn't because now I can with Mii. You can go to many different sites like Yahoo Japan Auctions, then you just buy the stuff through Mii. They order the items, let you know when they got it in, and then depending on how much you want to pay, they will ship the item to you, and you'll be eating snacks and looking at your figurines in as little as 1 week later. Now, to give it my seal of approval, I decided to try out the service myself and bought long large jagariko. I also ordered 35 pounds of raw Pepsi and a ring-fit adventure mat. And if you want something from Japan yourself, you can use the link in the description to get 2,000 yen or around $20 off your first purchase. And always remember, with Mii, you can buy anything from Japan. The Nintendo 3DS. There it is. It's a console that I did not have when it launched. It was too expensive for me, but I managed to get my hands on one in 2014 on Craigslist. It was scratched, it was dirty, but I put an Animal Crossing sticker on it so it looked kind of cute. I eventually traded it for a new 3DS XL Majora's Mask Edition, but I do have a soft spot for the original model. There's something about it that just makes me happy. Little did I know, this system was considered by many on the development team to be impossible to make. But it was through trial, error, blood, sweat, and tears that this console was able to be held in my hand today. So on this episode of Beta64, we are going to look at the development, the creation of the impossible handheld, the Nintendo 3DS.
To talk about the 3DS, we have to go back in time to one of Nintendo's first attempts at making 3D gaming a reality for the common folk. No, not the Virtual Boy. I'm talking about the Famicom 3D system. Released in 1987 and attached to the Famicom expansion port, these goggles featured an active liquid crystal shutter to make those 8-bit graphics really pop out at you. Pretty cool, right? Well, apparently it wasn't cool enough because it failed and never released outside of Japan, with only 7 games supporting the accessory before it stopped production. It turns out one of these games was the Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally, which was the first project that Miyamoto and Iwata worked on together, and they would later work on the 3DS together too, but that wasn't until many years later. So why did this specific accessory fail? Well, it seems that the criticism revolved a lot around the lackluster game offerings, rapid flashing visuals, and not to mention the 3D didn't really add much to the game. So you're telling me I've got to put on this whole headset just to see my games with like a little bit of depth? And my neck, all that added weight is just gonna tire out my poor neck. If only there was something it could stand on, like, well, a stand. Introducing the Virtual Boy 8 years later in 1995, featuring full tennis ball hitting you directly in the face goodness. Gunpei Yokoi, the father of the Game Boy and many other legendary Nintendo products, was the main person behind the Virtual Boy. But Miyamoto did have some involvement, since he was part of the group at Nintendo that really wanted to see Nintendo succeed with 3D. But once it became time for the Virtual Boy to actually become a reality, Miyamoto was too busy with the Nintendo 64 to be directly involved. In fact, the development of both of these consoles overlapped quite a bit, which some would say led to the Virtual Boy's demise. Since, why would I buy this 2D 3D console when I could get literal 3D? But the thing was, from Miyamoto's point of view, the Nintendo 64 and the Virtual Boy weren't competing at all. He saw the N64 as a way to usher in the new 3D gaming space head on, while the Virtual Boy on the other hand was meant to be like a stepping stone to bring people who were used to 2D into the 3D world. But it didn't really turn out that way. They couldn't really do much 3D stuff other than wireframe models on the Virtual Boy, and if Mario was going to be on the system, he needed to be recognizable, not just a bunch of lines. So all the games that had recognizable characters in them were made using 2D images, and that made the Virtual Boy seem much less appealing as a 3D console. Honestly, the console itself was made really to just be a fun toy to show your friends for, a little bit before going to play something else. And Miyamoto was hoping Nintendo would market it that way. But with Nintendo's history of being a toy company very much long gone by that point, and not to mention Miyamoto didn't really have any authority on the project, so yeah, it wasn't gonna happen. Instead of it being sold as a niche toy, it was sold as the next big thing for gaming, with a price tag of $179.99 at launch, or around $323 with inflation. So you can kind of see why it failed. I mean, it was expensive, it was being marketed as the successor to the Game Boy, even though it really shouldn't have been. And even if it was marketed as a toy, I don't know if it would have helped sales that much. I mean, it would have helped people see it as less of a failure because it did sell 770,000 units. But as a game console, that's not very good. And it certainly wasn't successful enough to launch the world into a 3D craze. Nintendo didn't give up though. For years and years, they kept trying to see if they could make 3D work with glasses-free 3D being the focus, because those goggles just haven't really been working out for them. Around the office, the two biggest advocates for 3D were Miyamoto and Yamauchi, who was then president of Nintendo. In fact, one of Yamauchi's missions in life was to make something in a game jump out at the player. And the next attempt at that was with the GameCube, which, believe it or not, includes 3D compatible circuitry even in the final version sent to store shelves. But it's not like you can just tear apart a GameCube and somehow make it work. What you need is a quote-unquote certain accessory put in, and only then can you start displaying 3D images. The main reason this was scrapped was because the special liquid crystal display, or LCD, it needed to display the 3D images was way too expensive back then. In a perfect world, Nintendo wanted to make their own display that attached to the system and sell it for 3D use. But it was becoming evident that it would most likely cost more than the system itself, which wasn't going to work for them. Now, if you've watched my video on Luigi's Mansion, you probably already know that the game was meant to fully utilize 3D displays. There was a build with 3D support already made, good to go, but it also got scrapped along with the display. Now here's a fun fact you may not know. At E3 2002, Miyamoto announced that Sega was going to release a new version of Phantasy Star Online for the GameCube featuring cards. And to show it off, they had the game running on a GameCube with a display on top. And that screen was made by Nintendo, would attach to the GameCube itself, and it would allow you to link up to 4 GameCubes together so that each person could get their own screen. This technology is what inspired Sega to make this card game version of Phantasy Star Online, so that way players could pick their cards in secret. But Nintendo had their own secret as well. This screen supported glasses-free 3D, but that feature wasn't disclosed until years later. At the show, it was simply touted as a little display for your GameCube, and was shown displaying Metroid Prime, as well as Wind Waker and who knows what other games, though it's not confirmed if they actually supported 3D like Luigi's Mansion did. And that was the one and only time that we got to see the 3D LCD before it was scrapped forever. But the GameCube wasn't the only attempt at 3D before the 3DS. Next, it was the Game Boy Advance SP's turn to attempt it. It used a special liquid crystal display, similar to the GameCube accessory, but this time built in. And it worked fine. But Nintendo ended up scrapping this just like the rest of them, only because the resolution of the LCD was so low that even though it worked, it didn't look very good. After all, an image for the left eye and the right one had to be displayed on the same screen, so you've got to make it high enough resolution or the effect is just going to look lackluster at best. But it wasn't over yet. Nintendo just needed a break for a little bit. During the DS and Wii era, there really wasn't any attempt to bring 3D to gaming. But on the side, Miyamoto and Yamauchi tried to bring 3D visuals to an exhibition they headed, which covered the Ogura Anthology of 100 Poems by 100 Poets. But that wasn't 3D in gaming. Sure, you used a DS to guide you through the exhibition, but any and all attempts to make something jump out at the visitors was done in the real world, not on any screen. And now we've reached 2004. The release of the Nintendo DS is here, and while the developers at Nintendo were hard at work making new games for the system, Umezu from Nintendo Research and Engineering Department had already made a complete SoC design for their next handheld console, which it eventually would morph into the 3DS. In case you don't know, SoC stands for System on a Chip, which is a single integrated circuit that includes all or most of the components that a computer or game system would need. By the time the DS was released, the System on a Chip for the 3DS, which it wasn't called the 3DS at the time, had already reached a point where it could be considered a working design, without any confirmation on what the new system would even be. They hadn't even remotely considered 3D at the time. All Umezu knew was that it had to be more powerful than the DS, with a focus on making the graphics more on par with what home consoles were offering at the time, but as a handheld, while making sure battery life would be awful. So with a complete SoC design written up and the DS having released, Umezu got to work on other aspects of the 3DS outside the SoC, like how many screens it would have. The DS had dual screens obviously, but Umezu wasn't entirely sure that the public would even like it. I mean, the DS had barely been touched outside of Nintendo's headquarters. He even made a prototype of the 3DS with only one screen, but after seeing people enjoying the dual screens of the DS, he decided just to go for dual screens, at least for now. And by the latter half of 2007, an early incarnation of the 3DS's SoC had been made with a focus on high performance graphics, with a little wiggle room, so that way once developers started thinking about what they wanted in the new handheld, there would be enough room to add their ideas. And as it turns out, that was the right call, because 3D on the 3DS means that you're rendering 3 screens at once. One for the touchscreen, and then one for each of the eyes on the main screen. Plus, since you have to display 2 images at once on the screen, that halves the LCD backlight, meaning that the brightness would have to be doubled. And by the end of development, all of that wiggle room was completely used up to keep that system going. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Let's focus on the summer of 2008, when things really started to take shape with the 3DS, just without the 3D. Since that feature Nintendo had tried so hard to include with other consoles, had been more or less forgotten by the majority of the development team. And speaking of the development team, back then Nintendo really liked having their hardware and software teams working together on these projects. And Miyamoto had invited software developer Hideki Kono to be producer of the new handheld console. And you may know this guy as the producer of Mario Kart Wii, director of Luigi's Mansion, and the director of Ice Hockey, all the way back on the NES. He was approached by Miyamoto just a bit after finishing Mario Kart Wii and while he was still working on the Nintendo DSi sound. And even though he was still kind of catching his breath from his previous products, he agreed to take on the role, surprised he was even considered at all, and began talking with Umezu about the new console. At that point, along with other team members, they locked down the idea for dual screens, as well as some other features, which needed to follow these 3 main goals. The player must be able to carry the system with them, connect to each other, and get something new every day. The first goal was accomplished by keeping the system small, but also by making it where the system included a step counter and other such features that actually made people want to take the system with them. To connect with others, there was the addition of the Friends list, as well as StreetPass, which lets you connect to people by simply walking past each other. This feature was specifically Kono's brainchild, and you can find its origins in another game that he produced, Nintendogs, though in that game you had to keep the game running in sleep mode to make it work. This was referred to in the game as Bark Mode and was later evolved into Tag Mode, which was included in Animal Crossing Wild World and Dragon Quest IX, the latter of which became kind of a social phenomenon in Japan. So much so that Kono's son used it way more than he used the Nintendog feature his dad created. But now that Kono was producing the console itself, he wanted revenge, so to speak. He wanted to create something his son would use more than Dragon Quest. He wanted a new tag mode that was bigger and better than before, and they accomplished that by adding the feature into the system itself, so that way it would work whether the game was running or not. Now for the final goal of getting something new every day, Spot Pass was created, which sent you demos and videos to explore without having to search it out. Though in order to make this possible, they would have to change the user's perspective on how to handle handhelds. Usually when you're done with the game, you'll turn off the system itself, at least back then. But for Spot Pass to work effectively, they needed you to have the system on all the time in sleep mode. So to make that more appealing, they included the charging cradle with the system, which also had the added benefit of making sure the system was always charged and ready to go in the morning. And at that point, that was the plan for the 3DS. Without 3D as a feature, it was really just going to be a better, more powerful DS with some nice added features. We actually happen to have a photo of the system at this point. This was the first model they made for the 3DS before it was 3D and without any cameras. This was referred to as the minimum model, which is what the team believed would be the minimal possible size for the system. And honestly, I'm actually kind of impressed how close they got. And after this model was made, things began moving forward as expected. That is until a very specific meeting where the idea of 3D displays was finally brought up by an engineer on the project. Hey, so what about trying 3D, they said, not having experienced the pain that many others in the room had felt from the failures of earlier attempts. But the more the room thought about it, the more they thought, you know, this could work. I mean, LCD displays were getting cheaper at higher resolutions, the hardware specs looked like it could support the feature, and they were working off the previously established DS, so they really had time to focus on getting it right. Plus, they were already kind of worried that the 3DS was just gonna be a DS again. After all, Nintendo loves to make their stuff special, and a 3D gaming console would be very, very special. Not to mention, with the display being built into the system, they wouldn't have to worry about people spending money to buy a special display either. That was it. That was the moment. This was what they were waiting for, and Miyamoto was set on it. But as far as the rest of the team was concerned, they kind of semi-agreed that it was the time for this. It sure seemed like it was, but for some people, 3D was a touchy subject. It wasn't so much that they were opposed to it, it was more like they were very concerned, and rightfully so. Even Iwata, president of Nintendo at the time, thought this might be a bad move. Was it actually going to be possible to make 3D succeed in gaming? Or would people think it's cool and then get bored of it very quickly? These were real concerns that needed to be answered. So in order to answer them, a prototype had to be made using the latest technology. And so they got to work. But it wasn't like, I don't know, a simple ball demo bouncing around to show, hey, you know, 3D works, it's cool. I mean, they did have a small visual demo to show Mario and Luigi in 3D, but what really won people over was a special build of Mario Kart Wii running on a Wii with a 3D display connected to the main board and a 3D slider hot glued to a nunchuck. Now that 3D slider, according to Miyamoto, was essential to the project to make sure that the player would be able to control just as much 3D as they wanted, or no 3D at all. Everyone's eyes are different, and to make sure it was easy to change on the fly, a slider was added to the system's hardware itself instead of it being done in software. Miyamoto was very adamant that it had to be a slider. It made it so that even if people found the 3D effect to be annoying, they could easily turn it off and keep it off without having to go in any menus. Even if it took like a couple seconds to turn down the effect or disable it, it would have caused much more distaste for the system. Allowing people to fine-tune that effect this precisely was a small addition, but a brilliant one. But Mario Kart Wii wasn't the only 3D Wii build shown off. There was also a special build of Wii Sports Golf. And being able to see this all in action, it was better than most people thought. In fact, it was really good. And thusly, it was decided the 3DS had to have 3D. Now, what about the controls on this new system? Well, it turns out that wasn't as easy of a question to answer as you might think. It was worked on quite a bit. The team wasn't really sure whether a D-pad would really be necessary if they added in an analog circle pad, but eventually they decided to use a circle pad and a D-pad, both on the left side of the console, though it was still split down the middle whether or not the circle pad should be above the D-pad or the other way around. So they made another prototype, this time using a DS Lite console with physical blocks that you could use to swap the controls around in order to try out different configurations while running a special build of Mario 64 DS. But while both the D-pad and the circle pad made it into the final version, there were plans to add a second circle pad that never came about. Now they did end up releasing a Circle Pad Pro accessory to add in the second pad anyway, and later the C-Stick replaced this option on the new Nintendo 3DS. But for this video, we're gonna stay focused on that regular launch 3DS. And that launch 3DS includes something Nintendo thought was just the coolest thing. A 3D camera. Now you'd think adding a second camera for 3D photos wouldn't have been that big of a deal. I mean, these aren't like expensive cameras capable of super high resolution photos, so adding two in should be easy, right? Well, no. The problem lied with the lenses, which needed their optical axis to be perfectly aligned with each other in order to make sure that the 3D effect of these photos worked well. There needed to be some incredible precision here, which made it quite a challenge for mass production. Not to mention they had to make sure that if you dropped it, the lens wouldn't go out of alignment, but adding too much reinforcement would also cut the internal wires, not to mention all three cameras needed their wires to pass through the hinge, and that, at this point in development, they weren't even sure if that was possible to do. So what made them decide to try it anyway? Because simply, 3D photos sounded way too much fun, and you know, they hoped it would make people happy. So yeah, why not? Let's give it a shot. But there was always something in the back of Iwata's mind at this time. How are they going to market this handheld? it really wasn't enough to say, yo, it's 3D, it's cool, it's radical, oh, it's fun too. What makes people go, wow, this is actually kind of cool, is trying it in person. So, you know what was coming up at this point? E3. And to really set the stage for the 3DS's success, Iwata told the team that it was imperative to have working 3DS units at E3 2010 for attendees to try and prove that the 3D function was, functional. Sugino, manager of the 3DS design group, was shocked at this and told Iwata that it was quote unquote absolutely impossible to do. But Iwata knew this had to happen, and he didn't care if it was actually in a 3DS shell or just in a giant freaking box, it just had to work. And Umezu got to work on a working SoC with 3D functionality to be physically made in working order in time to build the units. That was around January of 2010, and everyone was in a constant rush to get this all done before June. It was considered by many to be the hardest part of the entire development process, and it got even harder for Umezu when the idea of a gyro sensor was brought up in February, and they had to add that in before E3 too. At that point in development, the system already had an accelerometer in it, but the idea of a gyro sensor came about whenever Kono's department just so happened to be working on putting the gyro sensor of the Wii Motion Plus accessory into a normal Wii remote. One day, Kono walked in and showed off a demo of it working to Umezu. "Isn't this cool?" he said, and gosh dang it, it was cool. But the 3DS specs were supposed to be finalized already. It's February, March, April, May, June. That's 4 months away from E3. How on earth could they add this in before then? But Miyamoto was certain that it had to be put in, just like he was certain that the Wii Remote needed a speaker. So they decided just to try, hoping they would make it in time. At the other end of the office, designs were coming in on what the 3DS would actually look like, and the team was certain that the system just couldn't look like another DS. It had to be unique, it had to stand out, but that was easier said than done. During the presentation for how the system would look and feel, Iwata rejected all 6 proposals for feeling way too much like a DS. People needed to be able to tell this was a brand new system from the get-go, not just another console revision like the DS Lite or the DSi. So the team got back to work, and now happened to be behind schedule. Fast forward 1 month, featuring a lot of back and forth behind the scenes, the design group finally came back to Iwata with 3 designs that they believed were the best of the best. And the one that was picked just so happened to be Ehata's, who worked on the design of the DS Lite and the DSi. While creating the 3DS's look and feel, he wanted to try and break free from his past with the DS and attempted to achieve that by making the system look like it had 3 layers of different colors to show depth, much like the 3D effect gave depth to the games. It was also designed to give the system a different look depending on how you hold it, thanks to a clear layer with IML or in-mold labeling being used on places like the buttons to keep a sleek film over the labeling with a kind of metallic feel to it. Now that came with its own set of issues like warping, cracking, shrinking, wrinkling, but it's fine. The team will be able to figure out how to keep it from happening before release, hopefully. It all sounded super cool, it's no wonder it was picked, but being honest, Ehata wasn't even sure that this design could actually be made before E3. In fact, Akai, who worked in the product engineering department, flat out said that, while it might be fine with a few units, it was going to be impossible to mass produce later on due to the fact that the molds would likely wear down faster due to the stronger resin needed for the design to keep it from exploding into shards on impact. And after going through all the resins they were considering using, even the strongest one would still break on impact unless they made the system thicker. Not to mention the amount of facilities with the tech needed to make this thick system with IML and fiberglass infused resin was not a lot. But they had to give it a shot. This was the best looking design that they had, and even if it was gonna be a challenge, they were up for it. And it wasn't until the end of February 2010 that they managed to fix many of the major issues, including strengthening the hinge so that way it wouldn't end up like this. So it's almost March now, around 4 months until E3, and they finally were ready to start making a physical, working version of the 3DS. And that same month, Iwata announced to the press the 3DS's existence with details and a playable version of the console to follow at E3. And even though Iwata was totally fine with a simple prototype version to show at the show, the team desperately wanted to show off all the work they had done with a full working version of the console at the show. They all wanted this together, and had become a pretty tight-knit group at this point. When things seemed impossible, Yoneyama of the research and engineering department was there to say, "I'm sure we can do it," and people relied on that sense of confidence. Now, that's not to say he didn't want the best though. When the first prototype of the system was made for E3, the buttons just didn't really feel very good to touch, and he said for them to do it all over again. The public needs our very best, and that's what we're gonna give them. And the team followed along and did just that. In the end, they managed to make it in time for E3. Whew. And they didn't just make a few working systems for the show, they made 200 of them. Now, they weren't exactly like the final product. In fact, they kept working on the circle pad well after E3, using different materials to give it that nice rubbery feel for added grip. And the back of the system also wasn't really that done either, but hey, no one was able to see the back, so it was fine. What matters is that people were able to try the system firsthand. Attendees got to play games, look at a bunch of 3D scenes, some of which became StreetPass puzzles later, and they even got to check out some alternate colors for the system. I don't remember that gold one ever being released, at least looking like that. I wish it had though, that is sleek. And now with the show over and done with, finally, it was time to start focusing on completing the system's software features, which had been in development for about a year at this point, as planning for the software began around June of 2009. For the 3DS, they wanted to follow in the same footsteps as the Wii, where the included stuff in the system would be there so that way anyone who picks it up can find some fun in it, even if you don't own any games or don't consider yourself a gamer. And they came up with a lot of ideas that they wanted to include, so much so that they actually had to narrow it down quite a bit. But one of the main things they definitely wanted to do was improve the home menu. The DSi was a step in the right direction of what they wanted, but on that home menu, you could only see up to 5 icons at once. So with the 3DS, they wanted you to be able to see a lot more. To do this, they borrowed an idea from the Mii Photo channel, which lets you see a bunch of pictures at once, and then made a prototype for the 3DS based on that. Bam! Now you can see a whopping 60 icons at once if you really wanted to. Along the top of the screen, they chose to include a few general functions they wanted to be easy to reach, like game memos to take notes. The notifications list was meant to be a beefier Wii message board for messages from Nintendo and other games. And then there's the friends list, which was a massive improvement over the DS, where you actually had to register friends for each game separately. Now you could make people friends, complete with Mii's, and one general list that could be used with any game. This was an idea they wanted to implement a long time before, and now with the next generation upon us, it was the perfect time. Now what about the games? I'm talking AR games, I'm talking Face Raiders. Both of these games came about because the 3DS development team felt like the system needed something like how the Wii had Wii Play. They wanted to create a 3DS Play, so to speak, but this time as individual software on the home menu. And there were many ideas about what games to include, but they decided to focus on just 2 of them to really polish them up with the help of other teams like those over at HAL Laboratory. So first, let's talk about AR games, which was made by the Entertainment Analysis and Development Department, or EAD. And believe it or not, they had been working on this project for quite a while now, long before the 3DS was even a thing. They had made demos with this AR functionality and they were cool, but not really much of a game, and they didn't have any hardware they particularly wanted to run the software either. They tried it out on the DSi, but all they did was show a 3D model on a card and that was it. Still, they were proud of it and showed it off to Miyamoto, who told them, "This isn't really a game. What even is this? Where would we put this?" But Kawamoto, who ended up directing AR games later on, saw the technology as something more. And once it was decided that 3D would be added to the 3DS and that they wanted some games included, Kawamoto got to work with his team to turn the AR tech into AR games. From what I can tell, it was pretty smooth sailing from this point getting things put together, up until the end. See, originally the question mark card was the only card they were going to be using. The problem was that it looked a lot like the question mark block from Mario. And when Miyamoto saw it, he was like, "Oh, Mario comes out of this, right?" No. But we can add it. we can add it. Days were counting down pretty darn quick at this point, so they scrambled to make more cards featuring popular Nintendo characters, and in the end, they felt it was definitely worth the trouble. On the side, they also found time to make a giant AR card for life-size Miis, just for the fun of it. And immediately after trying it out, Iwata said that it was too good to not have it be mass-produced. And thusly, it was set to become a Club Nintendo item, with the normal wallet-size cards being included with the system itself. Now we move on to Face Raiders, which was made, get this, for fun, with a little inspiration from the Game Boy camera, which came with its own mini-games featuring faces. Basically, they wanted to make Face Raiders be the joke game of the built-in software, the punchline that makes you laugh and go, what? What is this? In the game, they included every funny face trick that they could think of. But then a little frustration happened. The merge lens. This funny little feature added to the 3DS camera lets you merge two people, and it came about because Nintendo's cooperation with Intelligent Systems. The camera team wanted to include facial recognition in the software, and to test it out, they asked Intelligent Systems to experiment switching people's faces, using the inner and outer cameras at the same time to make it easier to snap the photos. With this in mind, Intelligent Systems came back with a prototype that would eventually become Merge Lens, and it was so freaking funny. And why did this frustrate the Face Raiders team? Well, it should be obvious. It's because they didn't want to be out-funnied. They were the ones making the funny face software, gosh dang it. So, at the very end of the development, they added a new feature where if you're playing and someone's face is in view of the outer lens, it has the ability to put their face in the game too, just like that. So players would think, oh, well, what? I didn't take that photo, how did that happen? Not to mention they could also use the funniest of the merge lens by having it abruptly put merge faces into the games too. That's double the funny. This sort of friendly rivalry wasn't too uncommon around the office, since a lot of the team ended up working on the same floor, walking around the office, checking out what other people had done, showing off what they'd done. It created a real camaraderie amongst the team, and they also just genuinely enjoyed working together too. Now, even though those two built-in games got quite a bit of focus put into them, there was one piece of built-in software that received the most attention: Mii Maker. In 2009, Nintendo attempted to bring Miis over to the DS with the Japanese exclusive game Tomodachi Collection, whose sequel you probably recognize as Tomodachi Life. On the DS though, you didn't have any Mii Maker software built in, so you would have to make all of your Miis from scratch in the game, or go through the transferring process through the Wii. But for the 3DS, Nintendo wanted to have Miis take a more central role, so they wanted a Mii Maker put directly in the system, so that way games from the console could pull from a pool of Miis that you made on your system. And that is exactly what they did, with the addition of some new features, like the ability to stretch different parts of the face, along with new facial features entirely, to allow more variations than what were available on the Wii and DS. That way you had a better chance of making a Mii that looked closer to the way you look in real life, or you could just use the new tools to make an even more cursed Mii. It's up to you. I will say though, the main point of the software was to make Miis of yourself and your friends, which is why they added in the Photo to Mii feature. At first, this feature was just supposed to allow users to take a photo of themselves and view it side by side with the Mii creator, but once they showed it to Miyamoto, he said, you know, it'd be nice if it automatically made the Miis from the photos, but I don't know how that would work. And they didn't know how that would work either, but sure as heck we're gonna try anyway. And they were not getting very far with it, dang. But then, out of the blue, a company came in to show off to Nintendo a system that they had made, which automatically creates portraits based on photos of people's faces. The timing was impeccable, and they added in that feature into the 3DS. But there was a bit of a snag with it. It took roughly half a minute for it to actually generate the Mii, and that was the best that they could do. So in order to make the wait more bearable, they added a cute little animation to help pass the time. Now, the results of this wait can be a bit iffy, but they figured this is more about giving people a starting point that they could work from. It was their goal to make it as quick as possible to get a Mii that looked kinda similar to you, instead of having someone stare at the tool being overwhelmed and like, nah, I'm just gonna go for the default Mii. And going hand in hand with this big focus on the Mii Maker, there was also a big focus on the StreetPass Mii Plaza. From very early on, as I've said, there was a plan to bring tag mode to the next level in the system by making it where software wouldn't need to be inserted to use this feature since it was built into the system itself. But what about people who didn't have any software that used it? Then they can't use this feature that we've worked so hard on. Well, why don't we have it where the Miis that we worked hard on were part of StreetPass? Like having a Mii Plaza full of actual people you happen to walk by. That sounds like a great original idea. Well, it turns out it wasn't an original idea. This was actually in development for the DSi as a separate game called Traveling Mii, allowing you to play games with your Miis that you collect via tag mode. But because of the limitations at the time, which would be around 2007, you'd have to keep the game on at all times to collect the Miis from people you pass, and it just didn't sound like that good of an idea then, especially as a full retail game. So the idea was shelved. Then there was also Mii Parade on the Wii, which was another inspiration for StreetPass Mii Plaza. I'll admit, as a kid, I never understood what this parade was. Apparently you could view random Miis from the internet, see Miis from people you've played online with in certain games, plus Miis from friends' Wii remotes could appear here too. But for the StreetPass Mii Plaza, they were going to take it to the next level. Having Miis from people you actually pass in real life in one big plaza? Sounds cool, right? And it is, but is that it? Just a place to look at all the Miis you've collected from strangers? I mean, the team thought it was cool, but just not engaging enough. To make the Miis feel less like strangers, they added in the ability to add a custom greeting for, some uniqueness. It was better, but still not super interesting. Okay, what about allowing you to add your own custom music to a StreetPass playlist via the Nintendo 3DS Music app? So that way you can see what music is popular around here. That's cool. Yeah, okay. But what if we took the idea from Traveling Mii and made a few games to use these Miis with? That'd be pretty sweet and engaging too. And one of the first ideas they had was a game, get this, where you collect as many Miis as possible. That's it. Now there was another idea to make a game where players would try and pass by the same person several times, and both those ideas actually became Plaza launch games, though heavily expanded on. The first idea became StreetPass Puzzle or Puzzle Swap, where you collected puzzle pieces from people you passed to complete 3D pictures. And the other idea turned into StreetPass Quest or Find Mii, an RPG featuring the Miis that you collect, and if you just so happen to pass the same person several times, it levels up their Mii to become stronger. Not to mention, the passing the same person idea went a step further in the Mii Plaza itself, allowing the user to write a special message for specific people, and if they ever pass each other again, it'll give it to them. Iwata actually used this feature to help cheer on some of the Nintendo development team while they were still finishing up the 3DS. Mizuki from the Network Software Department Group of the Network Business Department actually got a special message from Iwata after a meeting that they had together that said, "Do your best on the matter we discussed. I'm rooting for you." It's that kind of work environment that kept everyone moving forward to create something truly special for everyone to enjoy. And with that, things began wrapping up, and Nintendo eagerly awaited how the public would take on the 3DS. Would it be a massive hit? Would it be a flop? Would the 3D catch on and become a new standard for gaming in the future? They didn't know, but not knowing can be kind of exciting. And in early 2011, the 3DS hit store shelves for $250 to mostly positive reviews, and it sold pretty okay at launch. And by okay, I mean it was the best-selling Nintendo handheld console launch day they had ever had, at least in the US. But the problem started to creep up in the following months. Once they realized that sales were already starting to slow, there just wasn't enough launch games to really sell people on it as a gaming console yet, and Nintendo themselves were still having the issue of how to get the 3DS across to the consumer. Like, oh, it looks cool, please try it. They had done events to let people try it out, but it just wasn't enough. And over fears of this being a gigantic loss for the company, who was already reporting a $485 million operating loss, they decided to cut the price of the system less than 6 months after launch. And it worked. The 3DS's price was brought down to $170, and sales of the 3DS increased by more than 260%. And around 8 months after the system's release, it had already surpassed the sales of the original DS in its first year. Crisis averted.
All right, believe it or not, now we have 7 minutes worth of content talking about unused stuff in the 3DS system itself. I'm talking home menu, settings app, including built-in software that was available on launch day. Now, you might not think there's a lot of stuff to talk about here, but there is some pretty interesting things, starting with the symbol list in system settings, where there are some strange pieces of text.
For instance, we've got listings for Windows Mobile, Xbox, PlayStation, and Xbox 360, all located in the system settings executable file system. Why they're here? Well, they're likely just debugging symbols, but that doesn't exactly explain why they're here. I don't know of any link between the 3DS and the Xbox and PlayStation stuff. It's kind of to be honest, just a mystery. And that's really it for unused text, but as far as graphics go, ooh boy, there are a ton of placeholder ones like these for face raiders, with this face in particular being used on the home menu banner if you don't have any saved photos. But in the game, it's called Dummy Face 128. And inside Mii Maker, we've got a bunch of placeholder images meant for Mii's, QR codes that are just blank, plus 2 more blank images, and the rest of them are just eyes, all of which are called some form of dummy in the game's files. Now I will say that though this eye is green, it was not actually meant to be that way in the game. All of the used eyes are green as well. They're just made white once they're put in game. And the blue part is changed to whatever color you want the Mii's eyes to be. For the Nintendo 3DS camera, there's an unused 3D picture in there that was meant for testing purposes. It's a freaking rhinoceros skull from the Tennoji Zoo in Osaka and was taken with a Fujifilm FinePix Real 3D W1 camera on March 29th, 2009. And then edited in GIMP on August 12th, 2010, likely to begin using it to test the 3DS software. With StreetPass Mii Plaza, once again, only looking at games that were there at launch, we've got quite a few unused stuffs. Like for Puzzle Swap, which has an interesting unused feature that allowed a puzzle to contain 540 pieces. The pieces are so small, in fact, that if you try to do it in-game, it will only show a question mark on the puzzle select screen. But once you select it, you can see all the puzzle pieces you need to collect to finish it. And if collecting 540 pieces wasn't hard enough, they're all pink, which means the only way to get those pieces is by getting one randomly when the puzzle is unlocked, or by passing by someone or receiving someone from Spot Pass who already has the piece. Basically, this would take forever to complete. And speaking of pink puzzle pieces, here are some unused layouts for them that actually seem possible to complete. And while there are puzzles you can get that don't have any pink pieces in them, like these 3, the versions that are used are actually in a different format. Now for the general Mii Plaza part of StreetPass Mii Plaza, we've also got some unused graphics for placeholder icons for 3DS and DS games. And then there's this 3D test image for plants and a debug font too. There also happens to be some maps for Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Panama, and were very likely meant to color the regions of people that you met in StreetPass. But the maps aren't complete. They're missing the lines that separate the regions, so none of these were used. But there are complete maps for China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, but they all go unused just the same. And if none of that seemed all that interesting to you, get ready. There's some very interesting unused graphics and other things in the Nintendo Zone app. And yes, I do know that this app wasn't released until several months after the launch of the 3DS, but I'm going to include it in this video anyway because it technically existed in the launch 3DS 1.0.0 system menu, but there was no way to actually use it. First things we'll look at are some general unused graphics, like a bunch of flags, an icon that says dummy on it, a placeholder icon for stamps in the Paint plugin, and an unused thumbnail that shows a screenshot for the Japanese version of Nintendo Zone. But you'll notice that it says DS on it, even though it's obviously a 3DS screen size. Not to mention, every single button here is almost identical to the DS version of the Nintendo Zone Viewer app, which could be activated on the system via DS Download Play. Or if you get close enough, it'll just show up on your DSi home menu, much like how it was on the 3DS back when it first launched, before a software update made it always available. Now, the button on the bottom doesn't look very similar, but that's just because the DS version I'm showing isn't connected to a Maku de DS hotspot. Now, what is Maku de DS? Well, it's actually a service started in 2009 between McDonald's and Nintendo, which allowed DS gamers to connect to McDonald's to get games, news, and food coupons. Now, once the 3DS released, you still could connect to those Maku de DS places, though it would be the same screen size as the DS. I say all this because this unused thumbnail is basically just a copy of the DS version of the Viewer app, meaning that this is a very early screenshot of the developers attempting to port the app to the 3DS.
Okay, I have saved the best for last. I'm talking about this unused graphic in the Nintendo Zone Viewer app, which is just of, Raccoon Mario and Super Mario Bros. 3. But this is part of a bigger unused finding. There is a hidden debug menu in the Nintendo Zone Viewer that is specifically made for the localization team and themed around Super Mario Bros. 3. And I have it working right here. So this is the Nintendo Zone Viewer app. It doesn't really work anymore, but I edited the files to add this little button right over there. If you tap it, it links us to Super localization, bros. This fun little place includes lots of links, like to the Paint plugin, which has a 999-second time limit to draw just whatever. You can't send it to anyone, it'll ask you to, and then just no. Next up, there's the Media Player plugin, which will play MoFlex files. And there aren't any here, so it doesn't work. You know, I probably should have just said outright that most of the stuff here doesn't work. There's some things that look like they can be tapped, but you can. But if you go to the bottom, you can tap here to go to the top.
And last, but certainly not least, we've got two hidden functions built into the 3DS itself that I'd like to talk about. These aren't functions hidden in the home menu. These are features so ingrained in the system, they have to be activated on boot. So the first feature is kinda hard for me to show off. In short, if you hold down the Start, Select, and X button while pressing the power button, it allows your 3DS to boot from a DS cartridge. But there are two big caveats to this. One, you have to do all of this while the system is closed. How? Well, to do that, you could just hold a magnet over the system's sensor to trick it into thinking it's closed. That solves that problem pretty easily. But that brings us to our second thing. You can't boot game cartridges. See, this feature allows you to do one thing: execute firmware from a DS cartridge. So this is very useful if you happen to have a brick system, because it's possible to put firmware files on a DS flash card and get the system to boot again. But as far as something cool that I can show you right now, yeah, no.
Now the second hidden feature I can show you. All you need is a completely wiped factory reset Nintendo 3DS and a game, just any game of your choosing. First, make sure it's powered off. Plug in your 3DS game into the back. Don't drop it. Now just hold A, B, X, Y, R, and then power. And watch what happens. What? What's this? This isn't the setup. This is the game. That's right. By holding down all these buttons and pressing power, you're able to boot up the game directly without having to set up the system at all. Now this does cause some weirdness though. Some things just don't work correctly. For instance, you can't use any Mii's, you can't use the friends list, you can't use StreetPass, you can't use freaking internet. And not to mention the games themselves have like some weirdness to them when you do this. For instance, I booted up Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. And booting it under this mode, your save data dies.
Now, when you're done playing your game, all you gotta do is press the home button, which simply turns the system off. This functionality was likely added for Nintendo repair centers, so that way they could boot from a diagnostic card or something to check the system out without having to set it up. Though I guess it could also be used for kiosks too. You know, if you wanna like put it out at GameStop, but you don't wanna set up the system, you could just boot into the cartridge like normal. Granted, you would have to disable the home button so people couldn't turn it off. Well, whatever it was meant to be for, it's a cool little thing you can try yourself and show off to your friends. Except your save file might get permanently deleted. You might wanna watch out for that one.
And that's the Nintendo 3DS, a system that was thought quite literally to be impossible to produce, at least on a massive scale, like they needed them to be. But here's the thing. It was thanks to the hard work and dedication of so many people on the 3DS team that made this a reality, not to mention all of the people who attempted to bring 3D to gaming for years before this. It's thanks to all of them that something truly special was made. In Iwata Asks interviews, you can really sense just how much this project meant to people. There are thank yous just thrown out left and right of people saying, oh, this dude helped me with this. I couldn't make it if it wasn't for this guy. You literally kept me going. I really think it's important not just to look at the hardware, the software, what's unused in this system. It's also really important to learn about just the people behind it. That's what interests me the most about the 3DS, and this is why I just really, really appreciate this system. Now, I don't know what the future holds. This could be the last Nintendo dedicated handheld console. And if it is, well, good on you guys. You went out with a bang.
Nintendo Switch Lite です。Nintendo Switch Lite は携帯専用ですので。
Well, good system, nonetheless.
Hey, I'm just gonna say thank you to for watching the video, for watching my streams, being a patron, just all of you. You've been very, very kind to me, so thank you for everything, and I'll see you next time. All right?